Noland. I am the Executive Vice President and Director of Studies at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. It is my distinct pleasure and honor to welcome you to today's discussion about securing critical mineral supply chains amid Chinese and Western tension. Critical minerals that underpin green technologies are vital to the Biden administration's plans to combat climate change, rebuild the U.S. semiconductor industry, and reduce dependence on China. China dominates critical mineral supply chains, and diversifying suppliers is a challenge the United States and its allies in the European Union and East Asia all share. Today, I'm joined by a truly impressive trio: Mari Pangestu, Cullen Hendricks, and Cecilia Malmstrom, who will address U.S. and EU approaches to building resilience in green energy supply chains and their compatibility with international trade rules, the role of major critical mineral producers like Indonesia, and how to foster closer policy coordination among producing and consuming nations. Mari Pangestu will lead off. Mari is a professor of international economics at the University of Indonesia, former managing director for development policy and partnerships at the World Bank, and was previously Indonesia's Minister for Trade. She will be followed by Cullen Hendricks, a professor at the Joseph Corbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver, and a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute. Last but not least is Cecilia Malmstrom, also a non-resident senior fellow at PIIE, and also a former trade minister, this time of the European Union. So after their opening remarks and any cross-commentary, I will open it up to questions that you can enter through the question function in the chat. So with that, I will turn the Zoom speakers box over to Mari. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus, and good day to everyone listening in. I've been asked to kick off today's seminar or discussion. And could you please go to the beginning? Okay. It is, next slide, please. And what I'm going to do today is to give you the context, especially from a developing country perspective, and this draws on the work done at the World Bank more recently. And then I will close with some perspectives of a resource-rich developing country such as Indonesia. So let me just start with the context that was already introduced by Marcus. We are talking about the issue of the concentration in imports and exports of a few firms and a few countries, and the prominent role of China in this critical minerals supply. And the issue is how to reduce dependence on China and diversify away from China, but at the same time, how do we cooperate? Next slide. I wanted to we have numbers on the import and exports of China and the other countries, but we don't often talk about the concentration at the company level. So I wanted to emphasize this because I do think this is an important point in the sense of the diversification question. Because what we found from data that the researchers at the bank did was that a small number of companies in China export critical minerals, but it's not just China. In other source countries, the degree of market concentration in critical materials is 3 times the limit of US guidelines, which is defined as 0.25 Herfindahl-Hirschman index. And in most sample countries, we had 37 developing countries in the sample. Just one firm accounts for about 75% of exports of each critical mineral group. And recently, we actually heard that Chile is intending to nationalize its lithium mining company. And why is this important? It goes to what Cullen has written about in his previous papers, about the importance of diversification is about expanding supply and refining capacity, especially in resource-rich producing countries, many of which are developing countries, and not reshoring and mining and refining capacity to the US or advanced countries. Next slide. And resource-rich countries are not that different in the sense of, could you just keep on going, Jessica? The resource-rich countries are also concentrated in one critical material, but they don't necessarily have the others. So you don't have a country that has all the minerals. And their markets are characterized by a high degree of market concentration of several stages of extractive value chains in the hands of few corporates. So the main message is keeping trade open and predictable is vital, not just to resource-rich countries, as well as for resource-poor economies, but also the importance of that trade and investment, I would say, being open and predictable to expand the refining and recycling capacity in raw material producing countries. But yet, continue, Jessica, one more point. Yet we are seeing approaches that are not really in line with the international trade rules, whether it's the EU rare earth strategy, potential EU-US critical minerals agreement, or linking the IRI credit for electric vehicles as to whether you or not you have an FTA with the US. And you see resource-rich countries also imposing downstreaming policies, including export restrictions. So next slide. So the reason for decoupling from China is really very important in terms of how you see that the production of climate-critical minerals is much, much more concentrated than oil and gas, especially on the processing side. On the extraction side, you can see that developing countries such as Chile, Indonesia, and Congo are also having high concentration of the extraction side. But this is also linked to the processing side because a lot of these mines are owned by Chinese companies. But on the positive side, next slide, there is a reason for cooperation and accommodating China's role in reducing the cost of decarbonization and climate change, especially for developing countries. So the first reason is that China's role in reducing the cost of decarbonization in other countries, given its dominance in wind turbine, solar module, and storage batteries. Next, the second reason is that globalized supply chains, next slide. The globalized supply chains for low carbon products push costs down faster than national efforts and will lead to faster learning and lower global prices. Next, the third reason for accommodation is that EU, US, China, EU, US, and China cooperation in low carbon supply chains will actually hasten technology tipping points, so that you will get the shift of markets to sustainably adopt electric vehicles. And this is also likely for other low carbon technologies. So those are the positive reasons for accommodation. Next slide. But we all know that a lot of these approaches are really not driven by economics, that it is about policies driven by security as well as techno-nationalist concerns. But I think it's up. We still need to emphasize the economic costs of decoupling or even partial import substitution, which is really about, at the end of the day, higher costs for going digital or for going green, which really penalize developing countries the most, and also not enable developing countries to be part of the sustainable global value chains that will emerge. And it is about high costs and getting it wrong in terms of which segment you are going to subsidize, distortions and inefficiencies, and disrupting the ongoing collaborative technological learning across global industrial ecosystems. So let me now close with some perspectives, next slide, from resource-rich countries. I have 4 slides here, so there are 4 issues that I just want to touch on. First, how, as resource-rich source countries, can we be a part of the friendshoring and qualify for the IRA or be part of the EU Global Alliance for critical minerals? Is the answer a limited FTA on critical minerals? Perhaps for Indonesia and Philippines and countries who are members of the Indo-Pacific framework, maybe it's about not necessarily an FTA, but looking at the resilient supply chain pillar and looking at that as kind of an entry point. Or if, I think, Cullen, you've made this point also, if you have security arrangements with these countries, that can also be expanding the definition beyond FTA. Another way would be to go through partners within the regional FTA, such as the East Asia regional comprehensive economic partnership. And then the partners that you go through is the ones that have the FTA with the EU and the US. But this will require managing the principles and what kind of rules of origin will emerge. So you would, within the RCEP, you can still engage with China and other members and export from a location that has an FTA with the US or EU. And this is already happening in the case of semiconductors. Next. So to the point of diversification and expanding the supply, I'm sorry, Jessica, go back one. In terms of increasing the value added, how to develop value added and be part of the sustainable supply chain for low carbon technology goods. It is about how countries want to expand and be part of this downstreaming. Maybe not the right way to go is to have export restrictions on raw material exports, which Indonesia did with nickel. And in the case of Indonesia, it did lead to increased output of smelter and steel production, and perhaps more efficient production by Chinese companies exporting from Indonesia. But it did lead to a lot of disruption and distortions in trade and investment, as well as retaliation from the EU, which took us to the dispute settlement. And we lost because it's violating the GATT prohibition on quantitative restrictions. Indonesia is appealing, and with the absence of the appellate body, we're not quite sure how this is going to play out. And EU has also imposed anti-subsidy duties on the imports of stainless steel from these companies, using the justification that these companies are getting preferential financing and other support by China to certain enterprises producing in and exporting from Indonesia, and that nickel ore ban benefited these producers because it depressed the prices. So the third slide, the third point that I would like to make on the resource-rich source countries is, next slide. How do we promote downstreaming in the electric vehicle space? Countries that have minerals want to have to be part of the electric vehicle and battery value chain. And it really falls on how you shape the domestic demand itself, but you also need to export at scale. And developing the battery industry is key. And having nickel reserves alone is not enough. You need other minerals like lithium and graphite. So the export ban on nickel invited retaliation and substitution, in fact, because the high nickel prices actually led to the push for cheaper lithium iron phosphate batteries. And then we also try to impose strict local content requirements, 80% for four-wheel vehicles by 2030. Which again, if you're not competitive, you're not going to be able to fulfill that. So the key is really global partnerships. With the largest battery and EV markets, such as the US and EU, which are trying to onshore the critical battery materials and electrical vehicles. So you need to have friend-shoring partners so that you can be part of the global battery value chain and secure the key elements, and also eliminate trade barriers. The study shows that actually we face more trade barriers with China compared to Thailand. And we really need to address things like that. So finally, the final perspective, next slide, on downstreaming is really a fundamental lesson that we as economists always come up with. The fundamental lesson is competitiveness rather than natural resource ability is really the most significant factor for downstreaming and the diversification and expanding of supply of these critical minerals. And availability of energy source is really key. And you want to have renewable energy, but it takes time. So Indonesia is having this dilemma. It will take too long, maybe 5 years to develop the hydro. So is coal acceptable in the short term or natural gas? How do you deal with this? Can you be part of the sustainable supply chain if you don't actually use renewable energy? And then there's the policy and longer term considerations. It's not about the restrictive trade policies. It is really about the infrastructure. It is really about the business environment. skills and technology. And to the extent you want to use incentives and subsidies, given your fiscal constraints, they'd better be well targeted. So let me stop there. Sorry for going a bit over 10 minutes, but I hope that I've been able to provide the kind of the kickoff discussion for Cullen and Cecilia to come in on.
Before I hand it off to Cullen, I would like to use this opportunity to plug a very interesting paper by my Peterson colleague, Adnan Mazerai, in the context of Mari's discussion of the location of these critical minerals in their supply chain. Adnan wrote a fascinating paper. It's on the Peterson website. It's titled Green Energy Depends on Critical Minerals, Who Controls Supply Chains, in which he and his co-authors analyze not only the sort of nationality of where the supplies are, but the nationalities of the firms that extract them and process them, and the ultimate ownership of those firms. And for some of these minerals, those three things are fairly closely aligned. And for some of them, they're vastly different at each of those three stages. So I'd recommend everybody go to the Peterson website and look for this working paper by Adnan Mazerai. Now, with that plug, over to you, Cullen.
All right, thank you, Mark, and thank you, Mari. That was wonderful table setting, and thank you for having led off. So I'm going to be talking about this, I think, a little bit more from, I guess, a U.S. perspective, though obviously I'm not speaking on behalf of the U.S. government here. So I'll start with my three take-home points and then elaborate on them in some length. So the first is that the Biden administration has called U.S. recent investments in domestic renewable energy and semiconductors and EV supply chains a moonshot. And this is to liken it to the space race. My argument would be that the ultimate solution to our renewable energy problems will be less like the Apollo program and probably a little bit more like the International Space Station. That is that what we're going to need here is a collaborative multinational effort. The United States simply can't go it alone. So that's the first point. The second is that the key challenge moving forward, I think, will revolve around managing the proliferation of these industrial policies in the US and EU, but also, as Mari noted, in critical mineral-rich countries themselves. And that finally, and I think this might be the most important point, supply chain diversification, especially to the United States, shouldn't just mean de-Chinifying supply chains. Chinese firms and technology will be critical to supply chain diversification efforts. And actual intentional efforts to exclude all Chinese content in the Chinese private sector are misguided, and they're bound to provoke retaliation, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit later. So now I'll elaborate on each of those in a little bit of detail. So in building more resilient supply chains for critical minerals, neither the United States nor Europe can afford to go it alone. Reducing dependence on China is going to require expanding production and processing capacity in third countries like Indonesia, but we could talk about many, many more. So despite all the rhetoric that you may have been hearing, there will be no fully made in America supply chain for critical minerals. The United States cannot hope to meet its goals solely through domestic production or even North American production. If you think about the vast program of tax credits and subsidies and the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act and the Infrastructure Act, they've been remarkably successful in catalyzing investment in US-based, say, EV battery and semiconductor assembly plants. But they've not expanded domestic mining and processing capacity very much at all. And they're unlikely to. I mean, barring any kind of advances in alchemy, right, which is more like sorcery than it is science, the U.S. simply doesn't have the ore to meet all of these kinds of ambitions. And even if it were to, and even if it did have the ore, the time lags between announced investments and production with greenfield mining projects are measured in years, if not decades, rather than months. So the subsequent notifications we've seen from Treasury and the IRS signal that there is latitude in interpreting what is meant by domestic content provisions in these pieces of legislation, which expand critical mineral sources to include friendly countries, which is currently being defined as countries with which the United States has a comprehensive free trade agreement, plus a limited agreement with Japan, and maybe down the road, agreements with Korea and the EU at some point in the near future. Now, that would be fine for some materials like copper and lithium, but not others like nickel and cobalt. So the United States needs a broader set of friends to meet this ambition. And that will likely mean going around attempting to create a patchwork set of limited free trade agreements with critical mineral-rich economies. The good news is that there are good candidates, as Mari alluded to, that share U.S. priorities on a host of issues, two candidates being the Philippines and Indonesia. I won't discuss the EU perspective at length. Cecilia obviously can do that. Now, in some more boutique minerals with national security implications and applications, like many of the rare earths, the US government will likely step in to build domestic capacity if capital markets are not forthcoming with the necessary investment capital. Many of these critical minerals are also strategic resources, which makes them key to building and sustaining modern high-tech militaries. But the defense community cannot and should not be counted on to perform this role throughout the supply chain across all critical minerals. So moving on to kind of the second point, China's position in markets for critical minerals, which Mari illustrated with some great figures earlier, that's not the result of manna from heaven, but that's the result of deliberate industrial policy that has helped it dominate processing. And that's true even for materials for which it itself is import dependent for the raw material, like cobalt. Attempts to diversify critical mineral supply chains are built kind of around the same logic. The challenge now seems to be managing the proliferation of these industrial policies, not just in the US and EU, but also in these kind of middle income, mineral rich economies. US and EU domestic content provisions create challenges in part because I think that they set up a battle over market share versus kind of a more pure kind of market stimulating approach that would drive cost of adoption down and would not kind of risk kind of wider trade friction. So I'm not going to say much more about that because I actually thought that Mari did a great job of covering that. And then there's also this issue of mineral-rich countries that are pursuing industrial policies on their own, and Indonesia is a prime example of that. Raw nickel exports, which is one of Indonesia's main kind of critical mineral endowments, have been banned since December, I believe, of 2020. And Indonesia was successful in kind of catalyzing or forcing, depending on how you want to think about it, downstream development in these industries. And actually, I think nothing breeds imitation like success. So now a similar ban with similar ambitions is set for Indonesia's bauxite, cobalt, and tin exports, I believe, in June of 2023. Indonesia sees these bans as pillars of its economic development plans, in part because they've clearly worked in the past. And so, I think that the success of these kinds of industrial policy interventions in the past may lead the Indonesian government and other governments to think about capturing value added even further down the supply chain. And that's where you start to set up some potential conflict with sort of the IRA and equivalent kind of European policies goal to build the especially the end stages, the highest value added stages of the supply chain domestically. Because there you would be moving into the realm of competing around EV batteries and not just around trying to integrate supply chains for the raw materials that feed into the ultimate product. Now, in the process of doing that, I think that there's also going to be continuing industrial policy intervention coming from China. There's significant potential that Chinese producers may, attempt to flood markets for critical minerals and batteries in the short term to drive down prices for these materials and to attempt to deter investment. You can take lithium carbonate, which is the refined product that's used in lithium-ion batteries. Prices for that have fallen about 75% since last November, largely due to developments in China, including the sunsetting of a subsidy for EV vehicle purchases and high battery inventories. But there may also be a strategic element here as well. And that kind of decline in prices is not a great short-term incentive to build new mines and processing facilities. So that's something of which to be mindful. Now, facing these volatile market conditions, I think there is room for coordinated policy responses from major importers like the United States and the EU. The key is to send kind of a strong and consistent demand signal that I think will help incentivize investment throughout the supply chain. Now, what form that takes will be kind of interesting. Creating a critical mineral purchasers club is one idea that we've seen floated, but I'm actually kind of skeptical as to the mechanics of such a club and also how such a move would be viewed by governments in mineral producing countries. But say strategic stockpiling initiatives with phased purchases over a long time horizon actually could help here in the same way that the International Energy Agency helps coordinate the maintenance of strategic petroleum reserves in member states. And then on this last point, supply chain diversification can't and won't just mean de-Chinifying these supply chains. Chinese firms and technology are going to be critical to supply chain diversification. So the US is starting this off on pretty aggressive footing. So beginning in 2024, any vehicle containing battery components manufactured by a US designated foreign entity of concern, and it's a diverse group of organizations that range from terrorist organizations, but in principle is focused on the People's Republic of China, will not qualify at all for these tax credits. And in 2025, that ban actually is going to extend to critical minerals. And US firms are attempting to interpret this foreign entity of concern rule in creative ways that reflect a desire to take advantage of access to China's leading edge technology in batteries. So Ford and Tesla have announced new EV battery production sites in the United States that are going to attempt to comply with these IRA provisions. But in doing so, they're going to be licensing technology from CATL, which is one of China's largest battery manufacturing firms, in order to access that firm's iron phosphate battery technology. So Chinese technology and Chinese firms are going to play a role in the Made in America supply chain. I think the same thing actually holds true in Indonesia. If we get around to this idea of these notional sort of limited critical mineral specific free trade agreements, Chinese participation in the Indonesian nickel sector cannot and should not be a stumbling block to those types of negotiations. If the goal here is to build more resilient supply chains by moving production out of China, then these tax credits flowing to some Chinese firms that are operating in Indonesia would satisfy that goal. If Washington, is comfortable with CATL technology helping build batteries in Michigan and Texas, it should not have a problem with CATL's investments in Indonesia's mineral sector. And then I think that just very, very briefly, I want to say the emphasis on moving substantial capacity outside of China is a good idea for many reasons beyond the geopolitical. All right, it's good because supply chain concentration in a single country presents a host of vulnerabilities related to natural disasters, which is something that we expect to see increasing as a function of climate change. And the second, and this is something Mari touched on, is that promoting kind of the development of downstream capacity in lower and middle income third countries is important because among the top producers of bauxite, cobalt, and nickel are countries like Guinea, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the Philippines. These are countries with serious need for poverty alleviation. And I think that building out these kind of supply chains in ways that are inclusive of those priorities and those countries is the right way to go. So with that, I'll stop and then look forward to hearing what Cecilia has to say.
Before we hand it off to Cecilia, I would like to thank Cullen for his intervention and to remind people, if you have questions for Mari, Cullen, and now Cecilia, please use the question and answer function in Zoom. With that, Cecilia.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Good afternoon or good evening from Europe. It's a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. And it's a very topical subject that we're discussing. Suddenly, just the last week's seminars about rare earth metal are popping up all over the world, which is, of course, a sign that this is a very interesting topic. Because, of course, we will need so many of these critical minerals in the future, both for the digital development, but most and foremost for the green transition, as has been mentioned. We need it for quantum computers, for tablets, for telephones, but wind turbines, electric vehicles, etc. And minerals such as those we are talking about, lithium, cobalt, copper, nickel, etc., will be the new global currency, and demand for them will increase 30 times if we are to meet the Copenhagen or the Paris commitments that the world has made. And that will increase the coming 20 years, according to the International Energy Agency. And I think these figures have been confirmed both by the World Bank and the European Commission. So the European Union has a program called Fit for 55. It is an ambitious set of laws in order to reduce CO2 emissions by 55% until 2030 and to be climate neutral by 2050. And in order to do that, you need a lot of these minerals in the green technology. The problem is, of course, that the EU is even more dependent on China on these minerals than the US are. They are owned, extracted, or processed by China or Chinese-owned companies. And Maria gave a very good overview of how the global situation is right now. So 90% of the dependence in some minerals come from China. And that needs to be reduced, of course, for security reasons. Europe have seen lately how devastating it can be to be very dependent on Russian gas when that is used as a weapon in trade. For security aspects, of course, depending on what happens in the Chinese Strait and the Taiwan issue, and the general need to diversify your supply. So how to do this? The Commission presented lately a rare earth strategy, a raw material strategy, in order to try to create a common framework to ensure, as they say, access to secure, diversified, affordable, and sustainable supply chains in critical materials. So the aim is to strengthen the European Union's own capacity to extract and process and recycle these materials, and they even set up goals. 10% of the consumption of the extraction in the EU, 40% of the annual processing should be done in the EU, and 15% of the annual recycling, and all this for 2030, which is very ambitious. And you should not buy more than 65% from one single country in these metals. So how to do this then? Because it's easy to say, well, speed up the procedures, the permits, the impact assessments, knowledge sharing, working with partners, and I'll come back to that, identify needs, scale up the skills, and so on. Because today, basically none or very little extraction is happening in Europe, but there are plenty of these materials. The problem is that they are very deep down on Earth. We have them in France, in Portugal, for instance, Sweden and Finland. A Swedish firm just announced a couple of months ago that they have 1 million tons of all these 17 rare earth metals deep down. But of course, you will need to get it out. And this process is lengthy, it is very expensive, it's a dirty process. And so far, all the permits and the impact assessment and the environmental backgrounds and so on take between 8 and 12 years. So the Commission says in its proposal that we need to speed this up. You should have pilots and you should reduce it to maybe 1.5, 2 years, which sounds very ambitious and frankly probably is not realistic at all. Because in addition, in Sweden and Finland up north, there is also the indigenous people and their traditional reindeer herding, and they are protected by the constitution. And of course, the political debate has already started. So this is going to be tricky. And furthermore, the supply chains, as both Colin and Marie alluded to, they are very hard to build because it's not only the processing and the extraction, then you have to make the metallization and the magnets and so on. And those are very hard. And China is 10, 15 years ahead of us in this. So it will be difficult, expensive to catch up, but probably it can be done. So what does all this has to do with the free trade agreement? Well, Japan has concluded a kind of free trade agreement with the US on these minerals in order to increase cooperation, evidently, and there's a lot of this. This is online, this is public, everybody can see it. But it is also to have access to the tax credits under the electric vehicles, under the Inflation Reduction Act. And discussions are ongoing between the US administration and the European Commission. And it has been announced by President Biden and President Ursula von der Leyen that they will conduct talk to see if they can make an agreement on this. Maybe based on the Japanese, but of course there is not much to sell. So it will be a kind of strange trade agreement, even if you list some principles of cooperation, of joint analysis, of trying to work with partners. And so on. Well, there is a bit of battery that could be sold, of course, but for the rest, as I said, it will take several years before they get out to the out of the ground. So it is, of course, a strange way of concluding trade agreements, and it further also dilutes the whole concept of a free trade agreement. There are definitions in the WTO where basically most areas have to be covered, and to limit it to principles on this is sort of creating new standards, which is complicated. So what could you do to get out of this? Well, Colin alluded to this. cooperation, some sort of global alliance, but you need to look at investments, you need to look at infrastructure, you need to look at the same sustainability chain, and working with allies in a broader alliance is probably something that would be much more efficient than to start extracting both in the US and in the European ground on a short-term basis. The European Union has a trade agreement with Chile. It has not entered into force yet, but it is likely to do so quite soon, and is also finalizing free trade talks with Australia, where there's also a lot of nickel, for instance. So working with partners in this regard, and possibly alliance of friends and a broader group, in order to try to also secure and make more sustainable the already existing supply chains, is probably a quicker way to reduce your Chinese dependence. I'll stop there, Marcus, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. So at this point, I would like to give the three panelists the opportunity to make any comments on the previous presentations. Then we'll go to the Q&A. There are several questions already in the queue. And if any of you, well, now we've got more questions. So please use that function on Zoom. So go to Mari first. Is there any comments you'd like to make on Cullen and Cecilia's presentations?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd really like to hear more about how can we make this cooperation concrete and realistic. I am not so sure that a limited free trade agreement in minerals is the answer, but do either of you have ideas beyond that? I mean, I propose some ideas from an Asian perspective, going through IPF, which is not necessarily an FTA. So because it seems like all we want is to be able to get access to the IRA credits, but I think we need to go beyond that, right? And see how can we actually have a win-win outcome in terms of having a cooperation across the sustainable supply chain.
Helen, Cecilia, you have any response?
I mean, I have one thought on that, and then this is kind of related to Cecilia's point about this sort of the Diet Coke version or the light beer version of a free trade agreement, and what we're really doing with these kind of interventions. I mean, so I think it was maybe last week or even earlier this week. I mean, the U.S. Trade Representative, Ty, just said that the United States was not interested and didn't see it in its interest to negotiate at this time a more comprehensive free trade agreement with the Philippines. The Philippines would be an obvious candidate as another nickel exporting country that has very extensive security relationships with the United States, and shared interest in diversifying away from its dependence for investment capital from China, and this is apparently a non-starter. And I think that the reason why that's a non-starter is because the United States has moved into a phase where it is relatively wholeheartedly embracing an industrial policy approach that preferences U.S. production at the expense of potential more comprehensive kind of free trade agreements. Now, obviously, this is highlighting one of the challenges here. Political will and deficit spending can get you a long way down the road, but it can't create nickel deposits where none exist. All right, so that's just a fundamental reality that we're going to have to ground any of these subsequent discussions in. And then what are we actually getting with these free trade agreements? We are getting a free trade agreement that I think that the Department of Treasury and the U.S. Internal Revenue Service think is fit for purpose for saying it's a free trade agreement so you can unlock access to these kind of credits. Nothing more and nothing less. And that's an unfortunate development, but I think that that's an honest assessment of how that policy is being interpreted.
Well, I was last, so I had possibility to comment, but just to underline that the whole notion of the IRA and access to the tax credit is sort of blurring the view of what we need to discuss, because that is hijacking the whole process. I mean, access to those credits, apparently it seems that if you look at the interpretation, what Congress really intended to do with this, maybe if you talk about leasing cars, you could have a more flexible interpretation of the local content and the production. But what we do need to discuss is how can we jointly cooperate to secure value chains and how to reduce our dependence on China in a broader alliance, and not calling that free trade agreement. It's a cooperation on critical minerals. So we're sort of blurring the whole debate by calling it free trade agreements. And this is what we should discuss, because of course, yes, there might be a case for getting out more of these materials on European soil, but it's a lengthy process. So let's focus on what we have, and let's help countries who have these assets already to make it more sustainable and more efficient, and helping with securing that part of the supply chain.
Okay, do we have any more comments or questions among the panelists before we open it up to the attendees? Well, if not, we have a number of questions in the queue. We have one from Mr. Ken Sakakibara, who's with the Asahi Shimbun newspaper here in their Washington office. He asks, it has been reported that China is considering a ban on the export of manufacturing technology for magnets made from rare earths, such as neodymium magnets. I hope I pronounced that right. Rare earth magnets are essential for EVs and motors, but the U.S. does not have this manufacturing technology. How should the U.S. secure rare earth magnets without relying on China? Has the Biden administration adequately addressed this issue? Does anybody have an answer for Mr. Sakakibara?
I have maybe the beginnings of one. I can go ahead and kind of try that. I mean, the first point I'd like to make is sort of meta-contextual, and that is that this is a clear response to U.S. export controls on semiconductors. This is a very predictable consequence of kind of securitizing trade and dual-use technology when you have these kind of interlinked supply chains. So these kinds of threats are the kind of thing that we should expect under, sort of the current direction of U.S. policy. That's not a comment on whether or not it is the right policy. It is a comment on what the predictable consequences might be. So what I think is being proposed by the Chinese government are export restrictions on neodymium magnet technology and then also samarium alloy. Now, neodymium and neodymium magnets are used, yes, in a variety of renewable applications, and also, I should say, near and dear to my heart, neodymium magnets are increasingly used in speaker technology. So we're not just talking about the future of the energy transition, we're talking about the future of rock and roll music here. So clearly something needs to be done to save the day. More seriously, these materials also go into defense technology. In particular, the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter uses almost half a ton of these, et cetera. So what's the United States doing about this problem? Well, I mean, there are in the IRA, there are tax credits and some subsidies for neodymium magnet production. This is beyond kind of previous budget allocations in previous years for funding for catalytic investment from the Department of Defense in rare earth processing capacity at a U.S. facility that's in Mountain Pass, California, adjacent to the U.S. only operational rare earth mining facility. In the fiscal year 2023 budget request, there are there have been similar types of requests made for different types of funding mechanisms. And then there's also kind of a notional discussion to continue on engaging on collaboration around rare earth supply chain development with the usual suspects, this would be the United States, Japan, European Union, Australia, and Canada. Is that enough? Well, in the event of an actual export ban, probably not. At which point, if all those things that were to work as planned, the administration estimates that it could make a significant dent in import dependence by 2026. Of course, if the spigot turns off completely, I think the Department of Defense will kind of step in to ramp up production in the short term to meet mission critical applications in key weapon systems like the F-35. But I think that would leave the consumer market in a real lurch. And this is just a specific example of a more general class of problem that we're facing when we're commingling these concerns about national security with these very globalized types of supply chains.
Thank you very much. You come to Peterson Institute in the morning every day and you learn something. Neodymium batteries and speakers. Excellent. There is a question from Matthias Pierre. Can we have a copy of Mari's presentation? Is this going to be posted on the Institute website? I actually don't know the answer.
You're welcome to have the presentation.
Okay, so we'll post that one. All right. So we have another question from Louise Chakuti. How did and this is interesting, it's a two-part question that basically provides an opening for all three speakers. How did the Inflation Reduction Act, Net Zero Industry Act, respectively affect how Global South is thinking about resource nationalism? And a follow-up, could you say a word on how the US and EU are thinking about Global South's reaction? So that seems to be teed up for all three of you.
Well, I think the IRA and kind of the industrial policy that we are seeing emerging in the US is actually giving a lot of sail to the winds of in the global South, also of industrial policy. But the global South has fiscal constraint, so they don't have deep pockets to give subsidies. So that's why you see the policies that come out are more about restrictions, local content requirements, which if not done properly, can actually not lead you to where you want to be. We've had lots of failures and and kind of learning and lessons from that. So I think for me, the last 3 years in the bank, because I've been thinking about development, I think we need to come up with better answers, what I call smart industrial policy. I think all countries are going to have some form of industrial policy because of what's happening, and politically they need to do so as well. So how do we have smart industrial policies that can really give you some results? I think we had this previous discussion at lunchtime, actually. What's the objective of industrial policy? Is it just to increase output? Is it about productivity? Is it about innovation? So if for developing countries, it's about increasing output and creating jobs, right? So can we, I don't know the answer, but I think a whole body of work needs to be done to make sure that we limit the costs of picking winners and then having a failure. What is the terminology? Governments are very bad at picking winners, but losers are very good at picking governments to say I'm the winner, right? So I think this is going to be very crucial for the global South to come up with smart industrial policies.
I'm rather concerned about this development, actually, I have to say, because this massive subsidy race that we see emerging from the US and spreading to Europe and to all over the world, and also putting pressure on the global South is worrying. Obviously, we need to invest in the green transition, all of us, and there are probably cases to have subsidies there. There are good subsidies and bad subsidies, but there is no forum today where we discuss these items. Ideally, we would discuss in the WTO, building on old subsidies agreement that do exist, but they are obsolete, so we need to update them. So we will need to discuss this, and on a global scene, ideally in WTO or G20 or forums like this, to say what are the good subsidies and how can we do it so that we jointly invest in the green transition and not compete against each other. So this race is actually worrying me quite a lot, I have to say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, Mr. Santiago Maron asks, Cecilia, did you mention the EU has an FTA with Chile? How would the current Chilean policy of nationalizing lithium clash with the current FTA?
That's a very good question. We have an agreement that is negotiated and it's done, but it hasn't been ratified yet by neither Chile and the European institutions. There has been some delays in translations and legal scrubbing and so on. I hear that hopefully later this spring, it will be decided by the member states and also voted in the European Parliament so that it can enter into force. The latest developments, of course, are not covered by the agreement because it was finalized a couple of years ago already. So I don't know what effects this will have. But of course, it needs to be discussed with the Chilean government to find out exactly what they mean by this and what consequences it will have for the free trade agreement.
And we have a follow-up question from a lady who appears to be Norwegian, and I would probably turn it over to Cecilia to pronounce the questioner's name. But she asks, to what extent are the EU objectives operationalized in terms of policy measures, and can this be pulled off without violating WTO rules?
Well, it depends a little bit what measures you are referring to. What is in the Critical Minerals Act and what is in the Green Deal and the different acts that follow from that would probably be, in line with WTO. Some might question whether, if making a trade agreement, if that happens, making a trade agreement with the US on this critical minerals or a Japan-US whether that is in compliance with the WTO standards as they are defined, and even in the GATT Chapter 5, I think, would probably not be meeting that. So could anybody challenge it? Yes, probably. And then there are, but other measures proposed to increase the extracting and the processing and so on in the critical minerals. I don't see that violating any international rules. They would be difficult to fulfill in such a short time span that is indicated in the Act. But and then there are some national laws on environmental protection and on, as I referred to, the Sami minority in Finland and Sweden, for instance. And this is something that Norway also has experience of dealing with.
The one thing I was going to just, I mean, this is not directly related to that question, but it's of a piece with Cecilia's response here in terms of the myriad kind of challenges with bringing ore to market in the European Union. One of the things that I think makes some sense, but is I think probably likely to elicit a lot of pushback, is the fact that for a subset of these critical minerals, which are also deemed strategic minerals, so these are the ones that are very intensely used in national security kind of applications, part of the Critical Raw Materials Act would streamline the permitting process to bring the time down for developing notionally these kind of new deposits from 5 to 7 years to 24 months in the case of greenfield mine developments and 12 months in the case of processing facilities. That would actually leapfrog in some senses the short timelines that are available in places like Canada and Australia. Whether or not I think EU members are going to be keen to see that kind of streamlining in practice when they start to think about what these mining operations actually look like and their local footprint looks like is a completely different question.
So we have another question. It concerns something that Cecilia touched upon in passing in her opening remarks, but the questioner wants sort of a more full treatment. The question is, the IRA content requirements under Section 30D apply to purchased and leased vehicles, but vehicles with any content produced in any country at MSRP can be leased under 45W to any business or consumer and receive the full credit. Leasing EVs has increased threefold since third quarter of 2022 as a result. Can the panelists comment on the minerals and components sourcing under 45W leasing?
I don't have the legal act in front of me and the different paragraphs, but this leasing interpretation was something that came about just recently. And of course, if that is the case, it could solve some of the concerns that was expressed not only by Europe, but also Japan, South Korea, and many others as well. And then that if you lease a car, you could then have access to the tax credit in the same way. And thereby a trade agreement would be redundant in that part. But maybe, Cullen, you have all the paragraphs in your head.
I don't know if I have the paragraphs in my head. I mean, I think that is the correct interpretation, and the figures that are quoted there. I haven't looked at them today, but I think that's of an order of magnitude that's pretty representative. I think that, I could spin sort of this development in a couple of ways. One, given the fact that we're in an arena with relatively rapid advances in battery and EV technology, leasing may not be a sort of a net negative for the consumer insofar as it will allow them the opportunity to avail themselves of improved technology over a relatively short kind of timescale. Now, that's a very optimistic kind of interpretation. This isn't directly related to the sourcing issue, because you're right. In terms of sourcing, my read of it is that anything goes. It does say something about the potential unintended consequence of this industrial policy to reshape the U.S. Auto market around leasing versus purchasing. And I'm not an expert, so I won't dive into the downstream implications of that, but it strikes me that they're potentially not exactly anodyne.
Well, Cullen is from Michigan, and I figured a Michigan male would have something to say about the automobile industry, and he did not disappoint. Our PIIE colleague, Alan Wolf, has asked, I think, a very nice kind of final question for this session, if you could address it very quickly. Alan's question is this. The speaker, I think he's asking the speakers to highlight unintended consequences and hurdles in lessening critical mineral dependence. How best to coordinate policy to be more constructive for the green transition? Where? With whom? What forum? So sort of the big picture question, how do we work better together to see all of this come about and avoid unintended consequences? Anyone can start.
Well, I think Cecilia had part of the answer earlier, but I think from an Asian perspective, I do think that using the regional agreement as a basis for building your global value chain, and then having continued engagement with US and EU, and if the WTO is not going to be the forum to do it, then it could be G20, or it could be ASEAN. ASEAN has this East Asia forum that includes the US and China. It can also be the Indo-Pacific. And to find kind of, I think both Cecilia and Cullen made it very clear also that you can't do this alone. You've got to, and China has to be an integral part of it. So how do we continue to have engagement with China, but at the same time address these concerns? But what you call it, put it in a context where you minimize, I guess, the kind of distortions. What are the principles that you want to use to be able to engage, continue to engage, and have because I think the ultimate objective is green transition that developing countries can afford. And I really want to make a call for this, in this, don't forget the global South, because they are paying the higher cost and the higher price and a slower speed of being able to do the green transition.
No, absolutely. I think we discussed that this is a very important point. But you do have the security point as well, not to be neglected, which is very important for the US, but increasingly also so for the US, for the EU. But doing this alone will not do. You will have to create some sort of alliance or build on existing networks or multilateral fora that already exists in a very broad group of friends and allies who can work together on this, because starting afresh is going to take a lot of time. It's going to be dirty and very expensive. So building on what there is and investing jointly to try to make existing supply chains broader, more diverse, and more sustainable and cleaner is of course a very important objective. And that includes North and South.
And very quickly, I don't know that I can tell you what the right venue is, but I can tell you what I think the wrong venue would be. I am very, I'm very bearish on the idea of this purchasing club that includes all of the critical mineral importers. I don't like it for what it is, and then also what it looks like. As Mari is talking about, you have these middle income and developing countries that can be part of the solution to this problem, that also have very significant development challenges that need to be met. And for the wealthy countries of the world that incidentally got wealthy, burning the fossil fuels that kind of put us in this predicament to begin with, to come to the table presenting a united front in a way that is oppositional to the interests of critical mineral exporting countries, strikes me as absolutely the wrong way to do this. We have to do better than that. We cannot have a repeat of sort of the worst aspects of sort of critical mineral sourcing, the kinds of which we saw during the Cold War.
Well, this has been a wonderfully interesting session. I apologize to the attendees who asked questions that we could not get to. There were simply so many, giving evidence of how interesting a session this was. Please join me in thanking Mari Pangestu, Colin Hendricks, and Cecilia Malmstrom for their discussion of this critical topic, no pun intended. Please come back for our next meeting at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and I declare this program adjourned. Thank you.